Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. My friends, the drag queen discourse is perhaps all the rage this Pride Month, and it is perhaps the most vicious debate I have seen in my short time observing politics, and I've seen quite a few. I've seen debates over universal health care. I've seen debates over taxation, which were also quite hectic back in their day, the 2010s, 2011s. I've seen debates almost every conceivable issue that's in the political lexicon. In the drag queen debate is the most vitriolic, but it's also the most crucial because it concerns, at the very center of it, some of the most precious assets that any person on this earth could have, and those are children. Now, unfortunately, since it does concern children, it is oftentimes a very emotionally charged debate. And I meditated quite a bit before I decided to do this video. I don't want to be adding to anger. I don't want to be adding to anything of that sort. The natural law theorist whose ideas were very essential to crafting our American Republic were very clear. They wanted us to subdue blind passion, in the word of Lord Combs in the Essays on the Principles of Morality. They wanted us to subdue blind passion beneath reason and regulate ourselves like a well-oiled machine so we could assess things in the light of truth, not in the light of pure emotion. But unfortunately, the debate is centered around pure emotion. But regardless of the debate itself, I think there's a point that needs to be expounded upon and needs to be explained in a more, thorough way. And that is the point that Drag Queen Story Hour and the justifications for drag queens teaching kids things are a menace. They are a threat, but not for the reason most folks think they are. Most folks use the argument that drag queens sexualize kids. Regardless of the truth of this argument, I don't think it's the most compelling argument, because there are plenty of drag queens who are going to be able to hit back and say, oh, no, we don't. We wear, high top gowns and ba-da-da-da-da. And the argument just gets taken down into a path of minutia, which gets involved in language games and gets us outside of the pursuit of truth. The more compelling argument, and the claim that I will advance for you guys today, is that Drag Queen Story Hour, with its foundational principles being that of a nature that opposes truth, does compromise and attempts to compromise, by their own admission, the imaginations of children by giving them improper reference points. And for that reason, children should not be exposed to such events. And Drag Queen Story Hour itself, as I mentioned a few moments ago, being built on anti-truth principles, should also not be seen as a legitimate form of education for anyone, much less for the most vulnerable minds among us. If my claim seems confusing, that's all right. I will make it clearer as the video goes on. But in order for us to critique the Drag Queen Story Hour movement, we have to understand what it is. Drag Queen Story Hour is an international program that has over 35 chapters in the United States, which is designed to teach for kids between the ages of 3 and 11 to be read books at public libraries by men dressed up as women, by men in drag. It was founded by Michelle T., who is a leftist author whose primary goal or primary study has to do with intersectionality, queer theory, and other sort of things in that subculture, which showcases her ideology. And she said, as a justification for why she established the practice and started Drag Queen Story Hour, that she wanted to see more non-heteronormative representation in libraries. She said that she took her son to a library to get read to by someone, and she didn't feel represented by the reader. And so she figured if we had more non-heteronormative representation reading books to kids, we would probably have people who feel more included. Now, Drag Queen Story Hour is a rather nascent phenomenon. It began in 2015 and has only gotten more controversial and more popular since then. But unfortunately, the reaction and the line of argumentation in support of Drag Queen Story Hour has extended. And I'm going to use a heuristic here to simplify the classes of arguments that people who support Drag Queen Story Hour make. I like to do it this way. I call it REL. REL. So proponents of Drag Queen Story Hour claim that it'll do one of three things or all of these three things. R being representation, E being facilitating expression of kids, and L being liberation. We just covered the representation argument, the idea that having a non-heteronormative face reading this stuff to kids would be good for people to feel more represented in those kind of areas. This argument suffers from a very clear epistemic flaw. Representation, like any other action, is limited. And unfortunately, since representation is limited vis-a-vis its nature, that means that not everyone can be represented in every single case, and that by representing someone in particular, you're going to ultimately end up not representing someone else. This is the problem that intersectionality theorists have had to deal with. Okay, if you're representing a gay black person, but not a lesbian, transgender, disabled person, I mean, what's the trade-off? How do you get both of them represented completely? The premise is also false. The premise is that identity characteristics themselves, constitute representation. They do not. Representation, in its truest form, is a descriptive action that involves standing for someone's values. The leftist idea of representation is an action that simply involves the appearance of representation, the appearance of that might be atypical to a certain area, like, for example, having a drag queen read in a context where drag queens normally are not. They're normally in bars and nightclubs. Having them go into a library is representation. There's an aesthetic quality to that, but that's not really representation in any meaningful sense of the word. Representation is limited, and if it is proper, it is based on values and based on the individual's desires, not based on mere characteristics. So since it's a limited faculty, a limited tool, it can't be used in the way T and other people who support DQSH want it to be used. Expression. The argument oftentimes made is that Drag Queen Story Hour allows kids to know that they can express themselves. A writer for The Advocate, a notorious magazine, said the following about Drag Queen Story Hour. He said, "Drag queens are incredibly talented at trying to live their lives and in the process brighten the lives of those those who watch them. That's the message that parents should be communicating to kids. At any age, it's about acceptance and being loved for who you are." So once again, it's about expressing yourself. Now the problem is, you can only express yourself if you have particular terms by which to express yourself. Expression is like a car. Think of expression like the relationship between a car and a driver, right? The driver, per se, can only drive the car well if he knows how to operate the car. And when we're talking about children, we're talking about human beings who are in a stage of immense developmental upheaval, so much so that their expression will fluctuate. One day they'll be a pirate, next day they'll be a princess, one day they'll be wearing shoes, next day they'll be wearing high heels or whatever. Now, that's just one crazy example. But the point is, childhood development is so fluctuating and creative and dynamic that expression itself has no solid foundation until the kid matures. So the idea that a child who is the equivalent to the driver, who hasn't even learned how to drive the car, and if he were to begin driving the car, would probably crash it off the highway, is in a sufficient place to express himself, does not seem to be borne out by the prima facie condition of what a child is. Then the last one, liberation. A drag queen called Nina West, who supports Drag Queen Story Hour, said the following. He said that drag helps kids dream big, be kind, and be their perfect self. It's an opportunity for them to think, for kids to think outside the boxes the silly boxes that adults have crafted for them. So the L is liberation. So apparently Drag Queen Story Hour allows kids to be liberated for the world that they step into, which is dominated by narrative and scripts, as these people, the ones who support Drag Queen Story Hour, oftentimes say. So we have, well, the problem with this is that this emerges from a very postmodern and thus anti-truth view of norms in society. Not all norms in society merely exist because society said so. Some norms exist because they're actually beneficial for the facilitation of a good and healthy life. For example, the norm of not murdering someone is not good because society said so. It's good because if everyone were to begin murdering people, or if murder was a very common occurrence in society, the society would break down and one's ability to be an ethical person would also break down. So norms, good norms, reinforce what is already there in nature. But the problem with the Drag Queen Story Hour is that the philosophy underpinning it treats all norms as inherently oppressive and as social constructs. So I've just laid out to you the arguments that Drag Queen Story Hour proponents use to justify their practice. Now we have to explain a little bit more about it as well. Little Miss Hotness, and this caught my attention, wrote a NBC News piece column, which basically said that attacks on drag queens or Drag Queen Story Hour rather, is an attack on freedom of expression and an attack on imagination. This is going to be a very important theme throughout this video, imagination. Little Miss Hotness is quoted as saying, imagination is powerful because it enables us to identify the status quo as a function that can be rewritten. Only by daring to see things from a new perspective can we remake the world and be more equitable, sustainable, and beautiful. She also said that drag is a creative portal to a new world, a catalyst, so to speak, for social change. And she groups critics of Drag Queen Story Hour indiscriminately, critics like me, into the buckets of white nationalists and authoritarians, and says what they apparently fear the most is that we are activating children's imaginations, that we show them it's possible to be whoever and whatever they dream, to reject the restrictive boxes and scripts, to build a world in which we are free of oppression, violence, and fear. Again, REL, representation, expression, liberation, destroying the boxes, being who you want to be, regardless of limitations of reality. And the problem with this sort of limitless, listless expression, as proposed by Little Miss Hotness, whose other writings are even more concerning than this, is that it doesn't recognize that reality itself has limits. But what it says is that imagination has no limit, which is correct. But it then takes that fact for granted to introduce the idea of subverting norms, subverting what they call boxes, and subverting ideas about gender and sex by using imagination as a vessel. It only states that it wants to do this. It never provides a justification beyond these are just restrictive and oppressive. Well, guess what? Reality is a matter of restriction. You cannot jump off a building without some kind of flying apparatus and expect to survive. That is a restriction on both human reason and a restriction on man's relationship with space and time. And these restrictions also help us live ethical lives. But the problem with the Drag Queen Story Hour idea of expression is that it bucks these restrictions. I'm not saying they want you to jump off a building, but it bucks the necessity of understanding these restrictions in other cases and says that the norms of society are simply oppressive because they're the norms of society. They don't investigate if there is a reality basis, a real basis in reality for those norms. And in some cases there are, some cases there aren't. In terms of sex, there certainly is. She also, so Little Miss Hotness created an article that was actually quite popular with Heather Keenan called Drag Pedagogy, where they essentially explain the inherent purpose of Drag Queen Story Hour according to them, which is why Little Miss Hotness's NBC News article is quite important here, because this is the person also writing academic works about the practice as well, and who's been one of the most prominent supporters and agents of Drag Queen Story Hour. And so this is a very popular article. I won't read all of it. I won't even go that deep into it. other than to say that in this article, Keenan and Little Miss Hotness identify 5 interrelated elements of Drag Queen Story Hour: aesthetic transformation, strategic defiance, destigmatization of shame, and embodied kinship. And I'm certain that there was 1 or 2 more that they didn't necessarily mention, and I haven't necessarily mentioned. But we'll forget those, and these are the ones that we want to look at for right now. So aesthetic transformation, again, a form of expression. Strategic defiance, defiance of what? Defiance of norms, defiance of systems. Why? Because they're inherently oppressive. And they say, the question they ask in that article is, what might Drag Queen Story Hour offer educators as a way of bringing queer ways of knowing and being into the education of young children? Now, my friends, if you're unfamiliar with what they mean by queer, they don't simply mean homosexual or whatever. In fact, that's not at all what they mean. What they mean, queer simply means that which is different. And in the context of this particular movement, Drag Queen Story Hour, queer means to subvert and to destabilize terms that have a set meaning. This is what Teresa de Lauretis in 1991 described it as when she crafted queer theory, and this is what queer theorists traditionally describe the word queer as. Queer exists to contradict and to subvert. It doesn't exist to create any stable meaning, because in their opinion, these established forms of meaning have been used to oppress people who are different from most people in society. So it all goes back. Drag Queen Story Hour is built on foundational principles that go back to believing that set meanings and objective standards are inherently oppressive. That's what they say when they say queer ways of knowing. That means being able to reinvent everything, being able to reconceptualize everything in terms of your subjective experience. Queer ways of knowing, because again, if queerness means to subvert, then if I have queer ways of knowing, that means that everything that I come into contact with, I can begin to question at a fundamental level and subvert its meanings. And being means I'm going to act out my subjectivist thoughts. But again, the principle of limitations. Reality is resolute and it cannot bear the brunt of certain actions. The queer method of being is a method of pure chaos, which has no inherent meaning, and ultimately, if it has no stable nucleus, no stable core to it, there's no consistent way to apply it, and there's no consistent way to apply it, it can be abused, and also, it can mean anything, which means that it is ultimately meaningless. For more of my arguments along these lines, please go to my video about queer theory that I made. It'll be in the comment section down below, in the description down below as well. That'll explain more. I don't want to get bogged onto that. So we've established Drag Queen Story Hour so far as a practice that seeks to teach kids about queer ways of knowing and being, seeks to teach kids that it's okay to defy norms, even if they have no justification for that, seeks to teach kids that it's okay to reinvent the status quo, even if they have no justification for doing so. It seeks to teach kids that all of these boxes that are around them, boy and girl, are arbitrary and subject to their imagination. And most importantly, Drag Queen Story Hour seeks to use a child's imagination to get these subversive principles into their heads. They're not even talking about anything sexual in this instance. This is all ideological. And this is the core of my argument here. My friends, what is the nature of imagination? For those of you who have stuck with the video so far, what is the nature of imagination? Imagination is, I conceptualize it as a sandbox in which particularly kids are able to take certain things they have perceived in the world and translate them into things that go beyond what is in the world, things that are even fantastical sometimes, things that are known only to them. And this sacred realm of exploration has developmental implications for a child's health. In fact, imagination is able to help a child cultivate problem-solving skills. It's able to help a child become more creative, and creativity also has a array of benefits for a child as they grow up as well. Exercising the creative faculty of childhood is an important way of stoking a healthy development in a child. But I add an addendum to that. It's only healthy, this is the Christian Watson speaking, it's only healthy if they have proper reference points. A child cannot imagine an ocean without first having seen an ocean. A child cannot imagine a fire without first having seen a fire. This goes the same for any other human being as well. No one of any age can imagine something without first having seen at least a glimmer or something like it in some way, shape, or form. All of us use reference points to, and particularly children, use reference points to be able to translate things to our imagination. Now, the thing about children's reference points is that a child has no way. Their faculty of reason is it's weakened. It's in development. And unlike an adult who can apply their faculty of reason to a reference point and separate it and analyze it, a child has no way of being able to analyze the reference point, which is why there are certain things that are non-appropriate and appropriate for children. Not because society arbitrarily willed those into existence, but the natural principle of childhood imagination being this raw, vulnerable sandbox of creativity has to be shielded from certain things. Because if it's not, it can become ingrained in the psyche of a child, and this can cause problems. This is why victims of sexual abuse, when they are given the reference point of abuse, are scarred for life. Because it impinges upon the reproductive faculty in the child's consciousness. What is the reproductive faculty, Mr. Watson? I'll explain to you. So there are two ways of processing things, or at least processing things that we learned in the past. We can either be creative with them, or we can either reproduce them. Now, the reproductive faculty in one's mind is what I call the ability to be able to take trace impressions, as it is said in scientific literature, and take those impressions and then translate those into a current memory, or to act out things we saw when we were younger in the current reality. So, for example, a trace impression of, let's say that you had a particular house that you were at when you were a kid, right? And you imagine at 20 years old what that house looked like, what it smelled like, what grandma was cooking or whatever. You're using trace impressions of the past, and that is being translated into the present. It still exists within your mind. Now, let us say that you remember watching baseball on the TV, and you, as a child, used to mimic the actions of the person on the TV. And let's say that you do the certain kind of thing in the current time as well, when you're 20 or 30 or whatever. You're now reproducing the memories that you had. You're not creating anything new. You're simply using what was already there in your memory to act out, to create an action. So how does the reproductive faculty of a child relate to drag queens? Very simply. The Drag Queen Story Hour project is attempting to give very heavy and haughty political and ideological principles, insert them into a child's imagination with improper reference points, which will then inevitably have a trace impressions effect, and it could have a more reproductive as well, a more repetition-based effect where we repeat previous actions that we've seen. I'm not sure, but it will certainly be there as a trace impression, and that will have been their first interaction with basic concepts of biology and basic ideas by which they had no exposure to previously. And this can give kids a distorted perception of reality. There are certain things, my friends, that should not go into the sandbox. There are certain reference points that should not go into the sandbox because, again, kids don't have the faculty of reason as a filter to understand and sort through these things. And drag queens, or rather drag queen story hour proponents, let me separate them from actual drag queens, by not refusing to recognize the limitation of a child's ability to cope with certain reference points, or the impact that certain reference points can have on a child, are doing a disservice to a child and showing their carelessness in this arena. And they're also showing that their pedagogy is ineffectual, it is not proper, and it is, instead of being pedagogy, it is indoctrination. Again, nothing to do with sexual stuff, and everything to do with exposing a child to improper reference points that then gets implanted in their imagination and corrupts their understanding of a particular topic. It is epistemic cruelty to corrupt a child's understanding of a topic they haven't even had the chance or the season to explore for themselves. It is epistemic cruelty. And yes, I apply that to everything else too. Everything else, whether it's a political rally or whatever, it is epistemic cruelty. This is how indoctrination happens. Whenever someone says, this is how it's been done my entire life, they are most likely a victim of epistemic cruelty. Well, I wear these kind of shoes because this is what my grandma wanted me to wear, and every time I didn't wear them, she'd get mad. That's epistemic cruelty. That's an improper reference point being used to influence you towards an action that you never had a chance to justify in the first place. And that's precisely what is happening with kids. And that is why kids should not be exposed to Drag Queen Story Hour, because Drag Queen Story Hour is meant to subvert the idea of sex as an objective standard, meant to subvert the idea of truth as an objective standard, and meant to implant a particular notion of those things into a child who has no capability of reckoning with them in any serious, substantial way, and that is epistemic abuse. To use something that someone cannot reckon with, has not, but cannot, by the development of the brain, reckon with, and then presenting to them as this is the truth. No. This is textbook indoctrination. So there is a basis in natural fact to reject this being exposed to kids. There's a basis in natural fact. Whether it's Drag Queen Story Hour's queer theory principles, whether it's the natural faculties of children that are not developed, whether it's the fact that childhood imagination is a direct link to real world actions, and that being tainted earlier will have an impact, whether it's negative or what, on real world actions. All of this stuff constitutes enough reason not to expose children to this kind of stuff. So we have to also ask ourselves, my friends, why truly are drag queens improper for children in the context of Drag Queen Story Hour and other events where children may be drag queens, with two drag queens, excuse me? Very simple. Anything is improper that does not contribute to the healthy development of a child. And how can a child develop in a healthy way in the midst of a philosophy which seeks to tear down the objective standards and rules and limitations that the reality the child will be developing and thrives off of? You can't have healthy development in the midst of a system, of an idea, or an anti-idea in this case, that would seek to undermine the very basis for what healthy or development might mean in the first place. Philosophies of chaos cannot foster order, and that is why drag queens in this context are quite improper for kids. So my friends, this is not a hate video against drag queens. This is not me saying that drag queens are decadent or bad. This is me saying that children should have a particular set of reference points. And as a parent, it is your job to shield your children from certain reference points, from profanity, from pornography, from seeing murder and violence when they're in their very development. We're talking about 3 years old, 4 years old here, the very developmental stages, because if you don't, their sense of the world will be warped, the perception will be shifted, and they may not be able to escape those trace impressions even after the reason is developed. Again, words are powerful, imagination is powerful, and if imagination is used in the wrong way, it can be deadly. Think on it, my friends. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, want to support my work, I'm sorry the video is long whatsoever, then please be sure to go to my Patreon, patreon.com/officialcwatson. Go to my PayPal, it's going to be officialcwatson@gmail.com. Please be sure to also subscribe to my channel, comment on this video, like this video, get us out there, share us on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok, on everywhere. I don't care where you are, minds. We have to get this message out there. This message is dynamite, my friends. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.